Effortless. Writing poetry is effortless. Hypher piss, lever kiss, Trevor Chris. Whoops, got a little lightheaded. So, that was the first poem in Bo Burnham's collection, Egghead. If you're watching this video, you probably know who Bo Burnham is, early YouTuber, singer, actor, comedian, etc. I'll confess that, as with many of the celebrity authors I cover in my videos, I don't know a ton about him, but based on what I have seen from him, I think he's smart and talented. So admittedly, I was a little disappointed when I saw this as the first poem in his collection. When I read it, I kind of felt like I was missing something, and maybe I am. I wasn't exactly sure what to take away from the poem. I think the charitable reading is to say that writing poetry without any effort is a bad thing. However, I think there could have been a more effective way to communicate that idea rather than just, lampshading, writing a poem that reads as effortless and bad. Of course, Burnham is a comedian, and the intention with a lot of these poems seems to be strictly to make the reader laugh, and I can certainly get behind that. There's certainly a place for humorous poetry in the wide poetic canon. Even so, this poem fell pretty short for me, even on the humor front. And I won't bury the lead, the collection on the whole fell short for me. Even so, there were a lot of poems I liked. So let's talk about Egghead, what works, what doesn't, and what we can learn from all of it. Let's start with the poems that feel unfinished. There are sort of two types of unfinished feeling poems in this work. The first being poems that read like first drafts, the second being poems that are interesting in concept but fall flat in execution. And obviously there's going to be some overlap between those two types. If you've seen my celebrity poetry videos before, you know that the whole concept versus execution thing is actually a pretty common gripe for me. And in the case of Burnham's poems, some of you might actually disagree with my assessments. Let me show you what I mean. Flowers. On the 3rd of June at 2:02, where once was a person, a flower now grew. 5 daisies arranged on a large outdoor stage, in front of a 10-acre pasture of sage. In a changing room a lily poses, at the DMV rows of roses. The world was much crueler an hour ago. I'm glad someone decided to give flowers a go. So I actually quite like this poem for a lot of reasons, both in concept and in execution. But I can't help feeling Burnham is leaving more on the table with this premise. I very much like what we do get, but I wish there were more. I don't necessarily need an explanation as to why everyone in the world turned into flowers, but I'd kind of like to see more examples. If we really break it down, the only specific settings we get would be a concert, a changing room, and the DMV. And those are good, but just think of all the places a writer could explore with this premise, not just physically but also thematically. The poem sort of punches you in the face with its message at the end. More showing of what Burnham is talking about here would have been appreciated, and we could have rolled organically into that ending he's going for. Then there's this piece. Hell waits. Hell waits in a doctor's office, tapping his shoe against a loose strip of carpet, holding a magazine in front of his face, trying to look professional whilst eyeing the children's toys. Again, the concept is certainly intriguing, this personification of hell as a patient waiting in a doctor's office. That establishes a lot of questions, and as with flowers, I don't necessarily need all the answers. But I feel I need a little more here. Is this the actual personification of hell? Or is hell just a stand-in title for an actual person? I ask because, in a way, the identity of hell doesn't seem all that integral to the poem. It feels like this could just be anybody. Like, haven't we all kind of been in this situation, or at least some situation where we wanted to act younger than our age, but we couldn't because it wasn't socially acceptable? With that being the case, why does it matter that hell is our main character here? Do you see what I'm getting at? And as I've said before many times on this channel, it's tough because you don't want to spoon-feed the audience, but at the same time you do kind of have to justify all your choices in a form as compact as poetry. Here's another example. Gangly. I'm a gangly kid, one of those drunk marionettes, one of those baby giraffes with inner ear syndrome, a flailing stork in high winds, a stilted freak. I am an easel, not symbolically, structurally. I attempt to dance and become a tornado of elbow. This is a poem that leaves me wanting more, but not in the I can't put this book down sense. No, more in the that's it sense. Don't get me wrong, I really like these metaphors, but I think Burnham could have gone deeper and come up with even more. When I reach the end of the poem, it doesn't truly feel like it's over. It feels like we're still ramping up. But then it just ends, and like I said, I'm left wanting. Then there's this piece. Let's see what the robots think. Before we go folding our clothes in a stack, let's see what the robots think. Before we go patting ourselves on the back, let's see what the robots think. Before we start working or dancing again, before we start writing love letters to send, before we start fighting or finding a friend, let's see what the robots think. I actually like this poem far more than I dislike it. This book came out in 2013, and back then, I think this piece had an entirely different meaning. Reading it in the context of 2026, though, how can we not read this piece with the long and looming shadow of AI darkening the modern landscape? In the current day, this poem reads as a clear criticism of those who rely far too much on tools like ChatGPT, among other AI tools and assistants. I do wish the poem were longer. I think it could have extended its premise further with even more rhyme and context. But now's actually a great time to talk about the sponsor of today's video, Ellipsis. Ellipsis is an anti-AI writing software made by writers for writers. Unlike other word processors in the modern day, Ellipsis will not use your writing to train any LLM, also guaranteeing that they will never sell your personal information to any third parties. The free version of Ellipsis is always available to use, but you can buy Ellipsis Plus, which includes pro features suggested by Ellipsis's own community of writers. For example, the emboss feature shares your authorship metrics with your audience, effectively proving that your writing is AI-free. There's also the Writing Insights feature, which I absolutely love, that gives you perspective on your syntax, word choice, and more, all without using AI. As someone who chronically repeats my favorite words, as I'm sure you can tell from my videos, the Writing Insights feature is to die for. On top of the anti-AI stance, Ellipsis's main appeal is the emphasis on collaboration. It's easier than ever to share your work, receive feedback, and integrate it on the spot. Ellipsis also has a monthly newsletter, custom templates for your inspiration, and a Discord server where you can find collaborators and accountability partners. You can use the QR code on screen or my link, ellipsis.app/rd, to start using Ellipsis today for free. You can also start a 7-day trial of Ellipsis Plus without having to give any payment information. So what are you waiting for? Get on board. Thanks so much to Ellipsis for sponsoring this video. Our next poem reads, Fixed. I gouged my eyes out, only to find another much better pair behind them. I go back and forth on this one. In part, I feel like it does have more to say, but at the same time, I kind of dig its brevity, especially when paired with the title. Like, if I were to just take the text on its own, if this poem were titleless, I would actually kind of take it to be a curse. The speaker wants to be blind so badly, but instead they only end up seeing better. It's like Oedipus meets Prometheus's regeneration. But the title, Fixed, leads me to believe this is actually a good thing, as if the solution to the speaker's problem was self-directed violence. As I said, I go back and forth here, but the more I think about it, the more I feel I might actually have to categorize this poem with those I quite liked. What do you all think? In any case, let's move on. Let's get into the poems in this book that feel like meta-commentaries, whether on poetry or on art itself. The first poem in the collection could potentially qualify depending on what we take away from it. Based on what I've seen from Burnham's other work, I think he's very interested in the idea of art itself, so let's hear a bit about what he has to say on the matter. Here's the fourth poem in the book. The Squares. The squares lived happily in their square houses, in their square yards, in their square town. One day a family of circles moved in from the west. Get out of here, roundies, shouted one of the squares. Why? Asked one of the circles. Because this is a metaphor for racism. So this piece is kind of funny, but I can't help thinking about its larger project. Is this a critique of the ways we try to teach prejudice to children? It reads that way. And not only that, but the piece suggests to me that these approaches are lazy and obvious, which is ironic given some of the other material in this book, but we'll get to that in a second. Some of my critique in this section of the video is probably going to sound defensive as someone who studied to be an English teacher and as an aspiring poet myself, but this piece's broader critique is silly to me. Does an allegory lack value simply because it's an allegory? Because it doesn't paint things in literal, real-world terms? Obviously not, and I'm sure Burnham doesn't think so either, otherwise he'd be rendering a lot of his own poems moot. Then again, maybe it's an indictment of authors who are too heavy-handed. But I think when it comes to such simple metaphors, especially metaphors for children, there can be a place for some heavy-handedness. You can say I'm reading into this too much and this is just supposed to be a joke, but I don't know, does the joke even land without the indictment aspect of the poem? Whether intended or not, there is a larger message here, and it appears to be one of depreciation towards certain storytelling methods. Next we have On Poets and Farts. Why do poets always talk about the ocean's waves, about their single-file march to shore, and yet never talk about my grandmother's farts, which arrive in time, one after the other with equal regularity? Are these poets too holy to comment on anything less than nature's flashiest gestures? Are we going to spend another millennia searching for meaning in sunsets and waterfalls? Or will we finally turn our ear to Grammy's rump, and away from all that pretty stuff, and hear that foul, muted trumpet sing, marking the end of an era? So throughout this book, and more than in any other place, with this poem, I wondered what Burnham's poetry diet consisted of. Like, what poems does he read? What poets does he like? Does he read a lot of poetry? I kind of get the sense that he doesn't, with this poem being just one example that points in that direction. Like, sure, I don't know of any other poem that specifically talks about a grandmother's farts, but to say poets just write about oceans or sunsets or waterfalls or nature, that's a super narrow view of poetry. Has the author read a poem since high school? Actually, I take that back. Even in high school, we read weird and wacky and creative stuff in my English classes. Sorry, I don't mean to be mean, but I can't help but get a little heated when people criticize a medium I care about so much from an uninformed perspective. Here's one that I find lands better. Rock. Rock on, indie rocker. Rock those bongos. Rock that weird African instrument that you purchased on that private school field trip. Rock on about that girl who left you because she got tired of struggling to get your skinny jeans off. Rock on about the poetry of the universe armed with the knowledge you gained by skimming a Wikipedia article on quantum mechanics. Rock on about pain and addiction, itchy beards and clove cigarettes, respectively. Rock against the labels, rock against the systems, rock against the world, rock against rocking. Rock. I find this one interesting because it starts out as an apparent critique of the privilege often required to participate in the arts. Oftentimes, if you want to do art and if you want to be good at it, you have to put in money. The surefire way to be published as a writer is to be independently wealthy. Even if you just want to be published in individual journals, those fees stack up. And oftentimes, in academia for the arts, only the privileged can get a degree in the first place, so there's this trend of privileged people in the arts writing about their privilege. This, in my opinion, is absolutely a worthy area of critique. But interestingly, the poem seems to transition into something more sincere, the idea that all art is valuable, even if it does come from a place of privilege. I don't know, I feel like there's a tonal shift here, but maybe I'm misreading to soothe my own ego. I'm very interested to hear what you all think of this one. In taking it from another frame of mind, the poem could be an acknowledgement that artistically most everything has been done before, even critique of art itself. Even so, we keep on making art anyway, and there's something beautiful about that, isn't there? But then we have a poem like this one. Life. Life, man. Life is a river. It twists and turns and has fish. Life is hope. Hope is love. So transitively, love is a river too. Pretty neat, huh? After reading this piece, I wrote in my notes, so are all of these poems purposefully stupid? Are they all meant to draw attention to how bad they are? How much can a reader tolerate that? If you couldn't tell, I was a little annoyed with the collection by the time I got to this point, but if you'll recall, the first poem in the collection also seemed to be self-referential in its lack of quality and coherence. Like that poem, this one is just lampshading. It's making fun of poor expressions of thought by being a poor expression in and of itself. It feels like it's just adding to the pile, no? At times, I just can't tell what kind of tone Burnham is going for, and it's totally fine to switch from a serious tone to a mocking one, obviously. But given the quality of some of these poems, I can't tell if I'm supposed to laugh at the speaker or laugh with them, and you can see how that might be a problem in pieces that were intended to be satirical. As a famous YouTube title puts it, if your satire fails, you just made the thing. Then we have a poem like this. Your mom. If I had $1 million, I would pay your mother to have sex with me. Afterward, I would probably invest the remaining $999,999. Burn. Is the final line of the poem really necessary? It feels like it's pointing at itself in, ironically, a heavy-handed way. In my mind, all poems are self-referential. They're always pointing out their chosen form, but self-referentialism can very easily become tacky and hokey without tact. Hey, tacky, tact, there's a relationship between those words, at least sonically. Maybe there's a poem in that. But anyway, I feel like a lot of Burnham's poems are pointing at themselves and kind of begging or demanding the reader notice how clever they are. It's very annoying. Let's get into more of the social commentary, starting with woman. I am woman. I am quite simply woman. Deal with it, pigs. Once again, the tone causes some confusion here for me. Clearly this tone is mocking and derisive, right? But what exactly is it mocking? Performative feminism? Shallow feminism? Or maybe it's a critique of women who generalize all men as pigs? I'm not sure. It's so underdeveloped, how can I say? I can't pin it down. It's almost a haiku, but 474 instead of 575. I think perhaps the most charitable reading of the poem is as a critique of individual feminism rather than collective feminism. Feminism that's for the good of one woman, but not for all women as a whole. That would explain the emphasis on the phrase I am, but like I said, that's the charitable interpretation, and I'm not sure if I can truly be so generous. Then there's this piece, the future. I reckon, don't discredit me due to the elderly start, that in the future, in the far future, if all goes well, two gay fathers will disown their son because their son wants to marry his clone. It's unnatural, they'll scream. It's an abomination, they'll cry. The son and his clone will run away together, beside themselves, armed only with love. They will hide in scrapyards and motel rooms until the bigotry passes, as it always does. I don't really know what to say about this piece other than it's weird, and usually I like weird, but this is weird in an eyebrow-raising way rather than in a whimsical way. I suppose at the very least it gets me thinking, but it feels like a false comparison. This feels like it should go without saying, but falling in love with a hypothetical clone of yourself feels quite different from falling in love with someone of your same gender, right? And I'm not saying it wasn't necessarily Burnham's place to write a poem like this. I think poets in general should write about whatever they want, but they have to do it tactfully. Even though I can get behind the message of this poem, things do tend to get more progressive over time, and thank goodness for that. The process in getting to that ending doesn't entirely sit right with me. Now, before I get into the poems I really like, I'll just address a few of the poems that I liked more than I disliked, but I think could have been tweaked a bit. Let's start with this one. Shia Cobalt. I don't want to die. It keeps me up at night. Because I know that when I die, whenever that will be, I'll probably wake up in some futuristic shopping mall having just spent 2 space dollars and a mere 15 space minutes living my life by means of one of the future's virtual reality massage chairs. Then I'll get up and watch the long line of people circle through living my life, then getting back in line. And I'll remember who I am again. I'm Shia Cobalt, a 12-year-old Pan-Asian Euro-American girl, and I'm a fugitive. This poem, especially given its place earlier in the collection, is shockingly fascinating. My main problem, though, is the ending. A lot of good endings feel like the beginnings of other stories altogether. I think that can be a strong exit strategy depending on the piece. This poem, however, feels kind of lacking in its ending, like we were just starting to go somewhere exciting, but we were cut off for no reason. This poem feels like the beginning of a completely separate story and would make for an interesting prompt. Where would you take the piece from here? Then we have Walk With Me. Walk with me now if you would, or wouldn't mind, or would mind not walking someone as I would. Speak to me now if you must, or mustn't be quiet, or must have forgotten something important, as I must have. Stay with me now if you can or can't decide, or can't not stay with someone, anybody, as I can't. One thing I haven't really touched on yet is that Bo Burnham loves his wordplay. A lot of the poems deal with something Burnham has simply noticed about a word or the English language. This is among the more successful linguistically diagnostic poems. It reminds me a little bit of Gertrude Stein, whom I discussed in my video on Atticus. The line breaks here are what particularly sell this poem. Walk with me now if you would is a complete phrase all on its own, so it's surprising when the phrase keeps going with or wouldn't mind. I'll also note it's neat how the last stanza has 5 lines instead of 4 like those before, emphasizing how it gets a little serious in spite of the silliness on its face. I do wonder if this piece is a little too nonsensical. It feels like another piece that's kind of pointing at itself too hard and sacrificing impact and meaning as a result. Then again, a lot of people might say the same thing about Stein's poems, so once again, I'll be very eager to hear what everyone has to say about this one. Moving on. Let's get into some of the pieces I really liked, and you'll probably notice a common theme among them, starting with wooden soldiers. I bought a box of wooden soldiers, I bought them from the store, and now 100 tiny soldiers guard my bedroom floor. So if you're a scary monster thing who wants to go to war, my bedroom door is open. I'm not frightened anymore. So this one's kind of cute. I like the idea that a positive imagination trumps a negative one. The belief that the wooden soldiers can protect the speaker is enough to dissuade a belief in any imagined threat. I quite like that as a message, and I don't have much more to say. It could maybe use a tiny bit of tidying up on the word level, but certainly no overhauling required in my humble IMO. Then we have I eat words. I eat words, delicious words. I gobble the words that you make. Words like rod taste like turds, but billow tastes like cake. I stuff my face with afterwards and wash it down with hush. Dessert must wait till after words, like hunch or flack or crush. And my dessert won't be dessert, that word is tough to chew. I'll have a word that's sweet and curt, like pony, nip, or blue. My first thought after reading this poem was fun. And it is fun. I'm not sure if curt is the right word in the penultimate line. It feels slightly like a forced rhyme, but then again I knew what the author meant by it, so I suppose it passes. As with the last piece, there are some nitpicky things one could change here, some small details. But all in all, like I said, it's pretty fun. And next we have what was probably my favorite poem in the collection. Ashley. Little Ashley hung magazine spreads on her wall after picking the magazines out in the mall. Models and actresses, singers and more, with cleavage and makeup and glamour galore. All of her heroes were finally nearer. Her whole room looked perfect, except for the mirror. As opposed to some of the other shorter pieces in the work, this one feels like it delivers its message in exactly as many words as necessary. Call that subjective, I won't argue with you, but this poem just very much feels like Burnham's bread and butter. Talking about fame and idolization is so completely in his wheelhouse. The premise is straightforward, the message is worth pondering, and the execution works. As you may have noticed, all of these poems could pass as children's poems. And when reading pieces like these, I wasn't sure why Burnham didn't just write this collection exclusively for children. In the book's acknowledgments, he gives a shout out to Shel Silverstein, which is awesome. I can definitely see the influence here, and fans of the channel will know I'm a big Shel head. Burnham also mentions his teachers here, which is maybe even more awesome. Viewers of the channel might also know that this channel wouldn't exist without my English teachers. But anyway, going back to readership. I'm often not sure the book even knows who its target audience is. A lot of the poems do read as suitable for children, geared toward them, in fact. But then so many other poems use harsh profanity or talk explicitly about sex. I suppose it's possible for a collection to contain multitudes, but it creates some serious whiplash from time to time. I do wonder if a different ordering of the poems might have helped, along with some delineated sections or groupings. Now's a good time to mention that this book doesn't have page numbers, which is just an unbelievable sin in my mind. How are you going to do a major book release in the 21st century without page numbers? Who do you think you are? But anyway, there are a lot of considerations to make when ordering the poems in a manuscript, and I would have loved being privy to that process for this book specifically. But while we're on the topic of readership, let me also say, this book often feels shockingly provocative just for the sake of it. I'm probably going to sound like a prude, but I don't know why this book is so vulgar at times. So many of the swear words feel unnecessary, as well as the aforementioned shocking content. Maybe I just feel that this book could have been easily marketed toward all ages. I don't know, maybe it's the Ursula K. Le Guin school of thought, that the more often you use the F word, the less power it has. You really have to be judicious about that word in particular. Now, if I haven't talked long enough, let me get into my final thoughts on this book. If I counted correctly, there are 195 poems in this book. And granted, most of them are pretty breezy, but that doesn't justify their inclusion. In fact, given just how breezy some of them were, I actually kind of question their inclusion. This book was, truthfully, a bit of a slog. I think it could have done with some more judicious cuts and some more critical editing. I don't know that I would have finished it if I didn't want to make the best video on it possible. Almost 200 poems is just way too many for a debut collection, especially given the quality we see in the end. On the topic of the provocative again, there's a lot here about relationships and sex and male insecurity, which is awesome. But as with many of the other poems, a lot of it is so obvious and in your face that it doesn't make an impact. There's no subtlety or finesse. It's actually kind of like the male version of Amanda Lovelace, where I can relate to the poems, but they don't truly stir my soul or give me a new perspective. Get back up there. Speaking of, Burnham loves to play with language, but never too thoroughly, and usually not in a way that's very eye-opening or unique. In many cases, after reading a poem, my only thought was, okay. Other times, the thought was, what? What was the point of this? So many of these poems simply don't justify their place in the book. I think, in general, the strongest reaction I had to any of these was just an exhale through the nose. Maybe that's harsh. Maybe I just expected a lot more. Commenters on Rachel Oates' video on the book point out that the poems are much better performed by Burnham than read on the page, but in that case, why were they published? Why not just leave them as spoken word poems, you know? If the poem can't stand on its own on the page, maybe it shouldn't be a page poem. But lastly, I don't want to forget to mention Chance Bone, who did the illustrations for this book. I thought they were alright. There were definitely instances where the illustrations added to the poems, which I suppose is the most you can ask for when you have an illustrated book of poetry. As a counterexample to most of what Burnham's got going on, consider this poem by Julian Talamantes Brolaski from its collection of Mongrelitude. The piece reads, Fried-eyed / banned poetry words. It's not the Russian, it's the Wu-Tang Crushin'. Wu-Tang Clan. Slip up and get craped like Suzette. Travel long to their erstwhile milieu, steeped in toxins. Ever fleshing them out. Along the crick, the fried fishlings foam and soak their minor manticores, battered eyeballs batting at you. The way the waves in the painting curve so many telltale infernal tickings. I knew I had to stop writing nonsense. Jack Spicer laughed and laughed, but Arturo De Simone wasn't laughing at me. And Brenda Iijima definitely wasn't f***ing laughing. And I used a poem with all the banned poetry words. Poetry, angels, filament, fear of saying thread, aperture, fear of saying hole, rococo, chiaroscuro, especially f***ing aperture, most banned poetry word. And there are more, I reckon. Thighs, language, the phrase, the body. It's the that does me in, Michael says. Gossamer, affected use of overpronounced Spanish in otherwise English language writing, pause, breath, anything French, liminal, palimpsest. Eye, ghosts, souls, beams when used of eyes, azure when applied to sea or sky, any poetic terms such as neath, tungsten, thrumming, esoteric plant names, references to fantastical places like Arcadia. Also tween and or, sand, Greek or Roman god names, desire, instance, espejo, gaze, mystical, deer, two-spicer, band, gunmetal, all tree names. Beyond, erotic, lone, single, all adverbs, we, word/world, hoarfrost, cheesecloth, any nouns made into verbs, ostensibly, matrix, kitsch, sediment, essence, architecture of, the social, mist, floating, moist, especially in the context of a moist night or evening, typically any penis, erection, nipple words, eternal, death, quiche, scry, limn, lapidary, sidereal, not banned, but groan-worthy, shard, salt, luminous, the phrase, in my mind. There is so much to say about this poem, but most pertinent to our discussion here, Brolaski actually strikes me as someone who reads poetry based on everything I see here in the poem. My favorite part is probably the phrase, the body. It's the that does me in. If you've ever been in a poetry workshop, you're probably deeply aware of how often that phrase comes up. I very nearly included it in one of the critiques included in this video, but I managed to stop myself. There's a strong humor as Brolaski's poem transitions to a prose poem, as it lists out all the quote-unquote banned words in poetry. Some of them certainly are words you see in a lot of poems, while others sound more like words that the speaker just has a personal gripe with. It's funny, and it's poetic, and what an ending. It almost reads as a criticism of the way we're told to separate ourselves from the speaker of our poems. How far can we divorce a poem from who we really are? How many words can we ban until the poem is not an expression of what's in our mind anymore? Granted, there are many other takeaways here, and I'll be interested to hear all of yours. And as far as Burnham's poetry goes, what do you think? Do you like any of his stuff presented here? Do you disagree with my takes? Have you read the book? If so, what do you think of it? Please, tell me everything. Hey, I've got merch now. Buying some is a great way to support the channel if you're able, and if you really like what I do, consider supporting me on Patreon. You're seeing my patrons' names on screen right now, and as always, I want to take this time to thank my patrons so much for their continued support. It truly means so much to me. It's really humbling. If you want to support the channel in other important ways, please do all the things the algorithm likes: liking, commenting, subscribing, hyping, putting toy soldiers in front of your door, that sort of thing. You can follow me on my socials if you want, but no matter what, keep reading, keep writing, and ultimately keep in mind, this is a rough draft. And for sticking around till the end of the video, have a writing prompt. For today's prompt, I want you to take Brolaski's poem title and use it as your own. Just the second half of it, banned poetry words. I want to challenge you though. As easy as it would be to make this a list poem, you know, a list of banned words, see if you can take it in another direction. You're welcome to start it as a list poem, but give it a dramatic turn, particularly one toward the speaker. When given this title, what is it you want to say about poetry and about yourself? Think about it. The time is yours now. Get to writing.